The DNS service is fundamental to the way modern networks function. And so you can bet that the domain name system is going to be mentioned on this exam in a number of different forms. So in this video, I'm just going to do a quick review on some terminologies and how it works. Then over the next 2 or 3 videos, we'll get just a little deeper into DNS. But by this point, you should be fairly comfortable with DNS. Now, if you don't use DNS on a regular basis with your job, or if you've not worked with it a whole lot, I would strongly recommend that you go read up on DNS from a Microsoft perspective. So make sure you're reading off Microsoft's website and just kind of hone up on DNS a little bit before the exam. So let's start the review. DNS, the domain name system, is a client-server protocol. We use it to resolve a host name, a user-friendly, human-friendly name, to an IP address. Or we can use it to do just the opposite. We can resolve an IP address back to a host name. Now, DNS really gets its power and flexibility from the fact that it maintains its data in a distributed database manner. And there are a number of terms and functionalities you definitely need to know for the exam. And so let's talk about 3 of them here. Then I'm going to do a little animation and talk you through how DNS works, and you'll get some more terms as we move on through some of the videos in the course here. First of all, a forward lookup query. This is simply when a client asks a DNS server, hey, give me the IP address for this particular host name, Microsoft.com or whatever. A reverse lookup query is when a client asks a DNS server, hey, I've got this IP address. They sent me something. Tell me what the host name is for this guy. So that's just the reverse. Now, these are also called PTR or pointer records that are used to provide this reverse lookup information. Now, a zone you don't hear a whole lot about when you're talking about Active Directory integration, but if you go back to the nuts and bolts of how DNS works, a zone is simply a portion of the DNS namespace that's controlled by a particular DNS server. In other words, all the data that DNS server needs to provide the DNS service is stored in a little database, and that's referred to as a zone. Now let's talk about how DNS works. Real simple example here. Different parts of the database are stored on DNS servers that are responsible for their little area of the network or the zone that they're in or that they're responsible for. You'll also hear the term authoritative. So let's take an example of Microsoft.com. You type in www.microsoft.com in your local browser, and your local DNS server in your network has no idea what the IP address is for Microsoft.com. So it's going to contact a root name server out on the internet to get the address of the .com department, if you will, or the .com name server. Then it'll query the .com name server and say, hey, by the way, what have you got on Microsoft? I'm trying to find an IP address for the Microsoft name servers. Now, after the .com server gives me the information from Microsoft, I then contact Microsoft's server at Microsoft.com. And then the DNS will provide the IP address to the client. So we're basically going to start to go from one door to the other. Hey, do you know where .com is? And it says, yeah, here it is over here on the internet. So I go to .com and I say, where's Microsoft? And they say, well, Microsoft's down here at this IP address. And then I go to Microsoft and say, where's the particular address I'm looking for? And it sends it back, and then that goes to the client. Let's look at it in an animation form. It's a little easier to understand. So on the client machine, we put in a browser www.technet.microsoft.com. Well, that goes to our local DNS server, and our local DNS server says, I don't know what you're talking about, technet.microsoft.com. I don't have an address for that. So the local DNS server says, to tell you what, since I don't know, I'm going to contact the root name server out on the internet and ask them for the address of the .com DNS zone. And so it says, here's the IP address for the .com name server, ask them. So now I'm going to contact the DNS server is, it's going to contact the .com name server out on the internet and say, do you happen to have an IP address for Microsoft.com? And it says, yes, here is that address. Contact Microsoft and get more information from them. So now we're going to send another query down to the Microsoft.com DNS authoritative zone and say, hey, I'm looking for an IP address at technet.microsoft.com. Well, Microsoft.com is well aware of that address. It sends it back and says, yes, here it is. We pass that down to the client. The client gets the IP address and it can now request the web page at technet.microsoft.com. I hope this helps you to understand. These are called recursive queries. We're just going to move through the hierarchy. There's a little bit of the database stored on the local DNS server, a little bit on the root name server, a little bit on the com server, a little bit at Microsoft.com. But by hitting all of them, we can eventually find out where we need to be on the internet or on any network to get the information that we need.